Welcome to PitchPoint, with me, Mary Janet Leith. Today we're celebrating International Women's Day, and I'll be talking about the experience of women in early music both today and also in the 18th century. Now on Monday, if you turned on a classical music radio station, you will probably have heard a wonderful schedule of works by women composers. Brilliant. But what about Tuesday? Wednesday? Today? Really, it's not enough to have one day celebrating the compositional talent of women and then return to a male-dominated musical scene for the remaining 364 days of the year. But fortunately, we have many fantastic musicians, both women and men, who are working very hard to increase the representation of women composers in 21st century programming. And of course there are positive, if slow, changes in the right direction. But in terms of practical steps, what we can do as an ensemble is, rather than just presenting a programme of all women composers, although this is great, we really try to include works by women in each programme that we do. Of course, this is not always possible, but this is our goal because we want to work towards a representative concert programming every day of the year. Of course, when we're programming early music, we do have an added difficulty, which is that very few women were able to publish their works in the 17th and 18th centuries, and if they did so, it was usually the exception rather than the rule. Again though, so many early musicians and researchers have worked incredibly hard over the past few decades to showcase works by women composers such as Jacquet de Legare, Barbara Strozzi and Isabella Leonarda. But we do struggle to move a little bit beyond these superstars. If you look a little harder and perhaps dig a little in libraries and archives when they finally reopen, it is possible to find more music written by women, particularly in the late 18th century, when the participation of women in music making generally increased. Musical accomplishment, as we all know from Jane Austen, was very much considered a mark of status. At this stage, women were not able to generally perform in public, but they did perform in a domestic setting, often organising house concerts for friends. Their own drawing rooms were a kind of semi-public space. After all, as any musician knows, performing for friends and family is much more challenging than performing for a large audience in a concert hall. Most elite and some middle-class women would have had some kind of musical instruction. And it stands to reason that a lot of these women would have been very musically talented. And we do know that they composed themselves. We have a lot of volumes of music owned by women in the 18th century, which contain all sorts of original compositions alongside music copied from other sources. But unfortunately, a lot of these are anonymous, although of course we can identify some. But just because music wasn't published doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And in fact, women were involved in some aspects of musical life in the 18th century, but perhaps not those you might expect. For example, in the city of London, many churches and institutions employed women organists throughout the 18th century. The English composer Jane Savage, for example, was an organist of one of the London asylums. Like many musical women of her age, she was born into a musical family. Her father, William Savage, was an organist and a composer. He had sung as a treble for Handel, and then composed much sacred music. It seems that Jane Savage must have received her musical instruction from her father. Her music reveals her to have been accomplished in composing keyboard and vocal music in a sort of typical galant style. She self-published a set of sonatas or easy lessons for the harpsichord or fortepiano when she was only 18, as well as a cantata called Strephon and Flavia, which took its texts from a collection of poems published by her mother. Jane Savage's relative wealth was undoubtedly what allowed her to pursue music further than most of her 18th century female contemporaries. She was her father's sole heir, and so she was able therefore to spend time and money on musical pursuits. However, as is very common, her musical activity ceased upon her marriage in 1793. Like Savage, the 18th century composer Elisabetta de Gamberini also had her musical activities cut short by virtue of her sex. She was not only a composer but also a mezzo-soprano, an orchestral conductor, a keyboard player and painter, and she was the first female composer in Britain to publish a collection of keyboard music. She came from a noble Italian musical family settled in Britain, and she probably studied with Francesco Gimignani. He and Handel subscribed to her published works. She also sang in many of the first performances of Handel's oratorios and gave her own benefit concerts. Yet sadly, a year after her marriage, she died, probably during childbirth, in her early 30s. Her story, like so many others, really gives an insight into the musical experience of women in the 18th century. So, time for some music. Our composer for today is Anna Bon de Venezia. She was an Italian composer and performer. Her parents, as is often the case, were both involved in music and travelled internationally. Her father was an artist, a librettist and scenographer, and her mother the singer Rosa Runivieti-Bon. At the age of 4, she was admitted to the Ospedale delle Pietà in Venice as a student. This was a kind of conservatoire, as we might imagine it, but mainly orphans attended. However, she was not a foundling. She was a tuition-paying pupil, because it did have the best musical reputation in Italy at the time. Once she had studied there, she rejoined her parents in Beirut, where they were in the service of Margrave Friedrich of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, and she then acceded to a post called the Chamber Music Virtuosa at his court. On the frontispiece of her Opus 1 sonatas, she declares that she published them at the age of 16. She also wrote harpsichord sonatas, divertimenti, operas, arias, motets, although most of these are sadly lost. We're going to play the third movement from her fourth flute sonata, Opus 1. So we've come some way from the restricted musical opportunities available to women in the 18th century. But of course we still have some way to go. Women face so many limitations in the classical music industry, and some of these are also present in early music. Most female musicians will have had the sneaky feeling that in many musical contexts, for example in competitions, a kind of masculine performance style is preferred. Fast and flashy is the order of the day. I've noticed this particularly in the recorder world, but it's a wider problem which is very difficult to quantify. The 19th century tradition of male virtuosic solo performance is very ingrained in our musical culture and is very difficult to challenge. Another issue that we face is that female soloists are often sexualized. We're expected to look glamorous on stage, even though this isn't necessary in order to display our talent. If we don't, we miss out on the media attention. But our choice of concert dress should be our choice, not a response to expectations within the music industry at large. How much more comfortable and assured might we feel on stage if we could perform in loose-fitting trousers and a shirt? Then, of course, we have challenges surrounding starting a family. To choose to take time off to have children is difficult. A freelance female musician may immediately lose momentum in her career, and rebuilding it even after a year out of the industry, while not impossible, can be very challenging. I know many inspirational musicians and now mothers who continue to perform late into their pregnancy and within a few weeks of the birth are performing once again. That's absolutely brilliant, but it should be a choice, not something which we feel we have to do in order to avoid losing our hard-won musical reputations. So we do have some way to come. But I would say, as an early music professional, the early music world does lead the way in terms of gender equality and representation of women. Florence, Magda and I have all been working in early music for some time now, and we have discussed this week the issues which I've been talking about, and we feel that actually we've encountered far less sexism and barriers to talent within early music than in classical music more mainstream. But of course that's our own experience, and we can't speak for all women working in early music today. But we do hope that early music can lead the way in making the entire musical world a place where women can work without discrimination. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Next week, it's International Early Music Day, and Tom and I will be exploring early music networks, performers and fans, and exploring how the digital age has brought us all closer together. See you then.